Sarah Mitchell glanced at her smartwatch, which read 9:47 a.m., as she jogged up the worn granite steps of the Jefferson County Courthouse. Her heart still raced from her morning run, which she hadn't had time to properly cool down from. The crisp autumn breeze caught her ponytail, causing a few strands of hair to escape her usually immaculate appearance. Inside her compact crossbody bag, she carried only the essentials: her phone, wallet, and the crumpled parking ticket that had brought her here. The notice, tucked away in her car's glove compartment for weeks, had been forgotten amidst proposal drafts and quarterly reports until her assistant, Jenny, had reminded her about today's deadline. The courthouse lobby buzzed with morning activity. Security guards directed the flow of people through metal detectors while lawyers, dressed in sharp suits, hurried past, briefcases in hand. Sarah joined the security line, standing behind an elderly gentleman struggling to remove his belt for the scanner. "Ma'am, please place your bag on the conveyor," the guard instructed with a tone that suggested he had repeated the phrase thousands of times. Sarah complied, slipping off her running shoes and placing them alongside her bag. While waiting to pass through the metal detector, she glanced at her phone. 3 missed calls from the Tokyo office and an urgent email about the afternoon's board meeting stared back at her. At 42, Sarah had spent the last 15 years climbing the corporate ladder at Global Tech Solutions, but handling a parking ticket in her workout clothes between international conference calls was a scenario she hadn't envisioned. The marble halls echoed with hurried footsteps as Sarah consulted the building directory. Courtroom 304, traffic violations, 3rd floor. She moved toward the elevator, but a handwritten out-of-order sign redirected her to the stairwell. The irony made her smile. Another cardio session was just what she needed. As she climbed the stairs, Sarah passed a young mother struggling with a stroller. Without hesitation, she stopped to help. "Here, let me give you a hand," she offered, taking hold of the stroller's front end. The mother's grateful smile reminded Sarah why she had started her mentoring program for single mothers in the first place. Reaching the 3rd floor, Sarah entered a hallway lined with wooden benches. A diverse crowd sat waiting, some in business attire, others in uniforms, and a few in outfits that had clearly seen better days. She found an empty spot on a bench near courtroom 304 and pulled out the ticket for one final review. The citation was for parking in a loading zone, a mistake she had made during a charity event she had organized downtown. Normally, her assistant would handle such matters, but with Jenny on maternity leave, Sarah believed in taking responsibility for her own oversight. Through the closed courtroom doors, Sarah could hear the muffled voice of Judge Henderson. Known for being strict but fair, his reputation preceded him. The courthouse regulars whispered their opinions among themselves as people entered and exited the courtroom, some looking relieved, others visibly frustrated. A court clerk emerged, calling out names from a list. "Sarah Mitchell," he announced, scanning the crowded hallway. Sarah stood, smoothing down her running shorts and adjusting her lightweight jacket. She was accustomed to commanding boardrooms in tailored suits, but today, she would face the judge in her workout attire. As she approached the courtroom doors, her phone buzzed again. The Tokyo office was persistent. She silenced it quickly, reminding herself that even corporate executives were not above the law. The heavy wooden doors creaked as she pushed them open and stepped into the fluorescent-lit courtroom. The room was smaller than she had imagined, with rows of wooden benches leading up to the judge's elevated platform. An American flag hung proudly behind the bench, and the morning sun filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. Taking her place in line with the other defendants, Sarah stood tall. Her posture, perfected through years of corporate training, was calm and confident. Unbeknownst to her, this routine court appearance was about to evolve into something far more significant, a moment that would challenge not only the judge's assumptions, but also ignite a larger conversation about bias and justice in the community. The bailiff called for everyone to rise as Judge Henderson returned from a brief recess. Sarah Mitchell braced herself to face what she thought would be a straightforward legal procedure, unaware of the extraordinary exchange about to unfold. Judge Robert Henderson peered over his reading glasses as Sarah Mitchell's case was called. His morning had already been filled with the usual parade of minor offenses and traffic violations. He barely glanced up from his papers as she approached the podium, noting only her casual workout attire. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Sarah stood before the bench. The judge's quick glance lasted only a moment, but in that brief second, his mind had already constructed a narrative. To him, she was just another person who couldn't be bothered to dress appropriately for court. Case number 2347, parking violation in a commercial loading zone, the court clerk announced. Judge Henderson drummed his fingers on his desk as he reviewed the citation. Years of experience had taught him to size up defendants quickly, and he had already categorized Sarah as another example of declining social standards. Ms. Mitchell, the judge began, removing his glasses and fixing her with a disapproving stare. Do you make it a habit to treat court appearances as casually as your morning jog? His tone was sharp, carrying the weight of authority that had made many defendants squirm over the years. Sarah opened her mouth to explain, but the judge held up his hand, signaling her to stop. His gold Harvard law ring caught the light as he continued. This court's time is valuable. This isn't a gym or a park. There were a few muffled snickers from the gallery, quickly silenced by the bailiff's stern glance. Judge Henderson shuffled through the papers on his desk with deliberate slowness. 2 hours in a loading zone, he muttered, his tone dripping with disapproval. Perhaps if you spent less time at the gym and more time reading parking signs, we would need to have this conversation. The comment was unnecessary, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew it. But years of dealing with what he perceived as disrespect had hardened his demeanor. Sarah stood perfectly still at the podium, her posture straight and composed. The judge failed to notice how others in the courtroom were beginning to sense something different about her, a quiet confidence that didn't align with his assumptions. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. Judge Henderson reached for his gavel, prepared to deliver both a fine and what he considered a much-needed lesson on respect. Before we proceed with your fine, Ms. Mitchell, the judge said, his voice heavy with authority, do you care to explain why you thought it appropriate to appear in this courtroom dressed for a workout? The courtroom held its collective breath, waiting for her response. No one, the judge thought, could possibly justify this level of disregard for proper decorum. He was unaware that Sarah's response would completely upend his carefully constructed narrative and force him to confront his own biases in a way he had never imagined. Sarah Mitchell remained composed, exuding a calm authority as she reached into her crossbody bag. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried, and the courtroom remained utterly silent, every eye fixed on her. She pulled out a sleek, black leather wallet and set it on the podium. Your Honor, she began, her voice measured and firm, I'll be happy to pay the fine with my corporate card. Her words were simple, yet they carried a weight that caused a ripple of murmurs in the gallery. Without pausing, she reached into her bag again and placed a gold-embossed business card on the podium. I should also mention, she continued, her tone steady and professional, that I am the Senior Vice President of Global Operations at Tech Solutions International. Judge Henderson's eyebrows rose slightly at her statement, though he maintained his outward composure. The courtroom was utterly still, the tension palpable, as Sarah's next words reverberated through the space. The loading zone in question, she explained, happens to be directly in front of our corporate headquarters. I was there that morning overseeing a community outreach program that my team and I sponsor. From her bag, she pulled out a folded document and placed it next to the card on the podium. The supplies we were loading were for our annual youth coding camp, which provides free technology education to underprivileged children in the city. Her eyes flicked briefly to the judge, her tone unwavering. Unfortunately, the permit for the event was filed a day late due to an administrative oversight. A collective gasp swept through the gallery, and the court reporter's fingers momentarily paused on the stenograph. Even the young law clerk behind Judge Henderson stopped pretending to shuffle papers, his attention fully captured by the unexpected turn of events. Judge Henderson's earlier sense of control wavered as the full weight of Sarah's words settled in. The calm authority in her voice starkly contrasted with the assumptions he had made about her moments before. His fingers, which had been tapping rhythmically on his desk, stilled. As for my attire, Sarah continued, her voice still steady, but now carrying a faint edge of challenge, I came directly from leading our company's monthly jogging initiative. During this program, we pair corporate mentors with at-risk youth to promote fitness and mentoring opportunities. She pulled out a glossy annual report and placed it atop the growing stack of evidence. Its cover displayed Sarah standing confidently among her team of executives. Our company employs over 5,000 people in the city alone and has contributed more than $50 million to local community development projects over the past year. The courtroom fell into a deeper silence as the weight of her words settled over everyone present. Judge Henderson shifted in his seat, suddenly aware of how deeply he had misjudged the woman standing before him. For the first time that morning, Judge Henderson's composure cracked and his tone softened. "Ms. Mitchell," he began, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. His gaze moved from the stack of documents on the podium to Sarah herself. But Sarah wasn't finished. Her voice carried an undeniable authority, one that filled the small courtroom. "Your Honor, I understand and respect the importance of courtroom decorum," she said, her tone professional but firm. "However, I would respectfully suggest that making assumptions about someone's character or professionalism based solely on their appearance can lead to incomplete conclusions." The gallery seemed to collectively exhale. Many people nodded in agreement, while others murmured quietly among themselves. Even the bailiff, who typically maintained a stoic expression, seemed slightly moved. Judge Henderson leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling from the new perspective Sarah had presented. The sunlight streaming through the windows now illuminated the podium where Sarah stood, casting her in a soft, golden glow, while his bench remained in shadow. Her phone buzzed again, the persistent Tokyo office demanding her attention. Without looking, she silenced it once more, her focus entirely on the courtroom. "I chose to prioritize punctuality over appearance today," she added. "Respect, Your Honor, is not always about what someone wears but about how they show up." Judge Henderson removed his glasses, setting them down on the bench. The simple act seemed to strip away some of the authority he carried. He cleared his throat, his voice quieter now. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, "in all my years on this bench, I've prided myself on being fair and just. But today, I find myself questioning how often I've let my assumptions cloud my judgment." The judge glanced around the courtroom, his gaze resting briefly on the faces in the gallery. "I looked at your athletic attire this morning and saw it as a sign of disrespect. I never considered that it might represent something far greater, a dedication to community service, to honoring commitments." Several people in the gallery dabbed at their eyes. The young law clerk behind the judge looked stunned, as if witnessing something historic. "How many times," Judge Henderson continued, more to himself than anyone else, "have I looked at a defendant and drawn conclusions based on their appearance, their mannerisms, their demeanor, without truly understanding their story?" The courtroom clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Sarah's expression softened, but her posture remained strong. "Your Honor," she said, her tone gentle but unyielding, "recognition is the first step toward change. And change requires more than acknowledgement, it requires action." The judge nodded, her words landing heavily. "You're absolutely right, Ms. Mitchell," he said, his voice steadier now. "Starting today, this courtroom will adopt a new standard, not for the defendants who stand before us, but for those of us who serve justice. We will judge cases, not appearances. Stories, not assumptions." A ripple of applause began in the gallery, growing louder with each passing second. For the first time in his career, Judge Henderson did not silence the crowd. Turning back to Sarah, he said, "You came here today to face a fine, but instead, you've given this court an invaluable gift, a mirror to reflect on its own practices." He extended his hand across the podium, not as a judge to a defendant, but as one person to another. Sarah accepted the handshake, their shared moment a symbol of transformation. The photograph of that handshake, taken by someone in the gallery, would later become a symbol of change in their community's justice system, a reminder that true justice begins with humility and the courage to challenge our own biases. Judge Henderson's hand lingered on his gavel, the weight of it suddenly feeling unfamiliar. He leaned forward, his eyes meeting Sarah's for the first time, not as a judge addressing a defendant, but as one human being facing another. The gallery sat in rapt silence, every eye trained on the judge. Even the law clerk, usually indifferent to courtroom proceedings, now watched with bated breath. The judge removed his hand from the gavel, leaving it untouched, and cleared his throat. "You are absolutely correct, Ms. Mitchell," he began, his tone carrying an unfamiliar humility. "Respect should never be judged by appearances. Today, I failed to uphold the standard of fairness I swore to uphold." He paused, looking out over the gallery. His gaze seemed to linger on the faces of those waiting for their own hearings, the laborers in worn work boots, the young woman holding her toddler, the elderly man nervously clutching a sheaf of papers. Each one, he realized, carried a story he had never cared to learn. "I made assumptions about you, based solely on what you wore. Those assumptions blinded me to the truth of your character and the weight of your contributions to this community," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "For that, Ms. Mitchell, I owe you not just an apology, but my gratitude for showing me what I failed to see." The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs of approval. Some of the defendants nodded, while others whispered to one another. Even the bailiff, who had spent years maintaining a detached professionalism, shifted on his feet, as if moved by the moment. Sarah's calm demeanor never wavered, though the faintest flicker of a smile crossed her face as she listened to the judge's words. Judge Henderson straightened in his chair, the morning sunlight now casting a warm glow on his bench. "Effective immediately," he announced, his voice rising in conviction, "this court will undergo a significant transformation. Starting today, we will focus on understanding the person behind the case, not just the charge against them." The young law clerk quickly began scribbling notes, his previous disinterest replaced with an almost frantic sense of urgency to document the moment. Judge Henderson's gaze returned to Sarah. "I will also personally ensure that mandatory training on bias recognition and cultural sensitivity is implemented for every court officer in this building, including myself." The courtroom erupted into spontaneous applause. This time, the judge allowed it to echo off the wooden walls, a sound of celebration rather than judgment. As the applause subsided, Judge Henderson continued, "Ms. Mitchell, it is clear that you do not deserve this fine. Therefore, the case is dismissed. But beyond that, I want to thank you for your patience and for holding this court accountable to a higher standard." He reached for the citation on his desk, tore it neatly in half, and set it aside. The act, though simple, felt momentous to everyone present. As Sarah stepped back from the podium, she felt the collective energy in the room shift. For the first time, the gallery seemed alive with a sense of possibility, as though they had witnessed something far greater than the dismissal of a single parking ticket. One by one, other defendants began to glance at one another, their nervousness giving way to something resembling hope. If the court could recognize its own biases today, perhaps their stories might also be heard without judgment. The young mother Sarah had helped in the stairwell gave her a small, grateful smile, cradling her child closer. An older man seated at the back of the gallery whispered to the person next to him, his voice filled with awe, "She didn't just win her case, she changed the system." Even the bailiff, who had stood rigidly by the judge's side for over a decade, seemed to relax. He nodded faintly at Sarah as she returned to her seat. Sarah's phone buzzed again. This time, she allowed herself a brief glance at the screen. Another message from Tokyo. She slipped the phone back into her bag without responding. For once, the meeting could wait. The courtroom proceedings resumed, but the atmosphere was irrevocably changed. Judge Henderson, now visibly humbled, addressed each subsequent defendant with a level of attentiveness and respect that had been missing earlier in the day. The young intern who had been sitting quietly in the corner was furiously typing on her laptop. She wasn't just recording the events of the morning. She was drafting a proposal for her professor about the need for systemic reform in judicial practices. As Sarah waited for the formalities to conclude, a man seated next to her leaned over and whispered, "Thank you. What you said today, it wasn't just for you. It was for all of us." Sarah offered a small, polite nod in return. She wasn't one to seek praise, but she appreciated the sentiment. She hadn't planned to become the voice of change that morning. She had only come to pay a fine. Yet, she knew that some moments carried far more weight than expected. As Sarah exited the courthouse, the fresh autumn air greeted her, crisp and invigorating. The worn granite steps felt less imposing now, almost welcoming. She paused for a moment, taking in the hum of the city around her. Her smartwatch vibrated again, signaling that the Tokyo meeting was about to begin. She sighed, realizing she would have to join the call during her drive back to the office. Yet, before she could leave, the young mother she had helped earlier appeared at her side. "Thank you again," the woman said, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "Not just for helping with the stroller, but for standing up there and saying what needed to be said. You gave people like me hope today." Sarah smiled warmly. "I only said what anyone else in my position would have," she replied, though deep down, she knew that wasn't entirely true. As she walked to her car, Sarah couldn't help but reflect on the events of the morning. The courtroom, the judge, the gallery, all of it had reminded her of why she had devoted so much of her career to community initiatives. Real change, she thought, didn't always happen in boardrooms or meetings. Sometimes, it began in the most unexpected places, with the smallest of actions. She reached her car, climbed inside, and glanced one last time at the courthouse steps in her rearview mirror. Today, she thought, was more than a simple court appearance. It was a call to continue the work she had started. And with that, Sarah drove off, the crisp autumn breeze carrying with it the quiet promise of change. After Sarah exited the courtroom, the atmosphere inside remained changed. Conversations had softened but carried a weight that was uncommon in such a formal space. The other defendants in the gallery seemed less anxious, inspired by what they had just witnessed. Judge Henderson sat silently on the bench for a moment, his fingers lightly tracing the edge of his gavel. It had been a symbol of authority for decades, yet now it felt different, almost foreign. The court clerk leaned toward him hesitantly. "Your Honor, shall we proceed?" "Yes," Henderson replied quietly, his voice thoughtful. "Call the next case." But as the clerk prepared to announce the next name, the judge raised his hand, signaling him to pause. Looking out at the faces in the gallery, Henderson addressed the room. "Before we move forward, I'd like to thank everyone here today for your patience." He hesitated briefly, his voice growing stronger. "What happened here with Ms. Mitchell was a lesson, not just for me, but for all of us. I will strive to be a better judge, and I hope this courtroom can serve as a place where justice isn't just spoken of, but truly seen and felt." The gallery stirred. People exchanged glances, nodding in agreement. For the first time that day, the courtroom didn't feel like a place of judgment. It felt like a place of possibility. The bailiff, a man who had worked under Judge Henderson for over 15 years, stood near the bench, his usually stoic expression softened. He had watched countless cases pass through this room, and though he had seen moments of leniency or sternness, he had never seen vulnerability from the judge. As the next defendant approached the podium, the bailiff found his thoughts drifting to Sarah Mitchell. Her composure, her professionalism, her willingness to speak not just for herself, but for others, these were qualities he had rarely seen in his years of service. Later that day, during his lunch break, he scrolled through his phone, looking up Sarah Mitchell's name. Articles about her leadership, her philanthropic efforts, and her work with underserved communities filled the screen. "Why didn't I know about her?" he muttered to himself. Then, shaking his head, he realized the deeper question. How many others like her have I overlooked? For the first time in years, the bailiff felt the need to question his own role in the system. Maybe justice wasn't just about keeping order in the courtroom, it was about fostering understanding. In her car, Sarah finally joined the Tokyo meeting via a video call. The faces of her international colleagues filled the screen on her dashboard display, their voices calm but eager to move through the agenda. "Good evening, Sarah," began the senior executive from the Tokyo branch. "We were starting to worry about your connection." "I apologize for the delay," Sarah replied, her tone measured as always. "I was handling a matter that proved unexpectedly significant." The meeting began, and Sarah deftly navigated the discussions about infrastructure investments, community outreach expansions, and global partnerships. But as the conversation unfolded, she found her mind returning to the courtroom. Toward the end of the meeting, Sarah's Tokyo counterpart asked, "Sarah, you seem unusually reflective today. Is something on your mind?" She paused for a moment, then smiled faintly. "It's been one of those rare days," she said, "when the importance of what we do feels especially clear." She didn't elaborate, but her colleagues nodded, sensing that whatever had happened earlier had only strengthened her resolve. That evening, Judge Henderson sat alone in his chambers, the day's events playing over in his mind. The torn parking citation still lay on his desk, a symbol of the assumptions he had so easily made. His hand hovered over a framed photograph on his desk, a picture of himself as a young man, freshly graduated from Harvard Law. He remembered how eager he had been back then, how determined he was to climb the ranks and make a difference. But somewhere along the way, he had grown hardened, relying on snap judgments to maintain efficiency in his courtroom. He thought about Sarah Mitchell's words, "Respect is shown through actions, not appearances." Reaching for a notepad, he began jotting down ideas for the bias training program he had promised. It would take time, he knew, but today's events had shown him how urgent the need for change truly was. By the next morning, news of the courtroom exchange had begun to spread. A local reporter, who had been seated in the gallery, published an article titled, "A Lesson in Justice: How One Defendant Changed a Courtroom's Perspective." The story described Sarah's poise, the judge's transformation, and the spontaneous applause that had filled the room. It quickly went viral, shared across social media platforms and local news outlets. Comments poured in. "This is what leadership looks like. We need more judges willing to admit when they're wrong." Sarah Mitchell is an inspiration. She didn't just fight for herself. She fought for everyone who's ever been judged unfairly. Meanwhile, at Tech Solutions International, Sarah's colleagues buzzed with pride. "Did you see this?" one of her team members asked, holding up their phone. Sarah's making waves, and not just in the corporate world. Even Jenny, Sarah's assistant on maternity leave, sent her a message. "Boss, you're trending online. Also, you're amazing." The courtroom moment didn't end with the applause or the article. Judge Henderson followed through on his promise to implement bias training, not just in his courtroom, but throughout the entire Jefferson County Courthouse. Sarah, too, found herself at the center of a new movement. Community leaders reached out to her, asking if she would speak at events or help design initiatives to address systemic bias. At first, she hesitated, worried about balancing these requests with her corporate responsibilities. But eventually, she agreed, knowing that the message was too important to ignore. 1 month later, Sarah stood on a stage at a community forum, addressing a crowd of local residents, court officials, and business leaders. "What happened in that courtroom wasn't just about me," she said. "It was about recognizing the power of fairness, empathy, and the willingness to change." Her words resonated far beyond the room, sparking conversations across the city about how to build a justice system that truly served its people. As Sarah Mitchell's courtroom experience continued to make waves, invitations began pouring in. Universities asked her to speak on leadership, nonprofits wanted her input on bridging the corporate and public sectors, and community organizations sought her advice on fostering equity. One request, however, stood out. The Jefferson County Bar Association invited Sarah to deliver a keynote speech at their upcoming event titled, "Rebuilding Trust and Justice." Initially, Sarah hesitated. "I'm not a lawyer," she told the organizer over the phone. "Are you sure I'm the right person for this?" "Ms. Mitchell," the voice on the other end replied warmly, "what you demonstrated in that courtroom transcends legal expertise. It's about leadership and accountability, the very qualities we need in this field." Sarah accepted. On the day of the event, she stood at the podium before a packed audience of judges, attorneys, and public officials. She began by recounting the events in courtroom 304, sparing no details about her own shock at being so thoroughly misjudged. "But the real story," she said, her voice steady and clear, "is not about my fine being dismissed. It's about what happens when someone, whether a judge, a leader, or a citizen, chooses to reflect and change." Her words struck a chord, earning her a standing ovation and solidifying her role as a bridge between the corporate world and the justice system. Meanwhile, Judge Henderson had quietly begun reshaping the culture of his courtroom. True to his promise, he initiated regular bias awareness workshops for himself, his staff, and other courthouse personnel. One morning, a young public defender approached him after a session. "Judge Henderson," she said, hesitating slightly, "I just wanted to say that your openness to change has inspired a lot of us." The judge, now less quick to dismiss praise, gave her a small smile. "It's a start," he replied, "but we have a long way to go." He also began seeking opportunities to engage with the community outside the courthouse. At one such event, a panel on equity in the justice system, he sat in the audience as Sarah Mitchell spoke about the need for leaders to challenge their assumptions. Afterward, he approached her. "Ms. Mitchell," he began, his tone softer than it had been in court, "I want to thank you again. That moment in my courtroom, it changed me." Sarah met his gaze and replied, "And your willingness to listen changed a lot more than just me, Your Honor." Back at Global Tech Solutions, Sarah began weaving her courtroom lesson into her corporate philosophy. During a quarterly leadership meeting, she introduced a new initiative aimed at expanding mentorship opportunities for employees from underserved backgrounds. "The courtroom taught me something critical," Sarah told her team as she unveiled the program. "Bias can appear in subtle, unexpected ways, and the only way to combat it is to actively create systems that level the playing field." The program quickly gained traction, attracting praise from both employees and external stakeholders. Soon, other companies in the tech industry began reaching out, eager to replicate Sarah's model. Her CEO, during a meeting to review annual goals, remarked, "You've turned a parking ticket into a revolution, Sarah." Sarah laughed lightly. "Sometimes the smallest moments have the biggest impact," she replied. Months later, Sarah found herself revisiting her experience in Courtroom 304. Inspired by the community changes she'd seen since that day, she wrote a letter addressed to Judge Henderson, the court staff, and even the people who had been in the gallery. "I want to thank you," the letter began, "not because the outcome of my case was favorable, but because that moment became a catalyst for change. It reminded me, and hopefully all of us, that every interaction carries an opportunity for growth." The letter was published in the Jefferson County Gazette, where it became widely shared. Readers from across the city commented on how it captured the spirit of the movement that had emerged since that pivotal day. Judge Henderson, upon reading it, felt a swell of gratitude. He placed the clipping on his desk, right next to the photo of his younger self, as a reminder of what true justice looked like. 1 year later, Courtroom 304 became known not just for its cases, but for the transformation it represented. Defendants began arriving less fearful, knowing they would be heard without judgment. The courthouse implemented regular community feedback sessions, and Judge Henderson became a vocal advocate for systemic reform. Sarah Mitchell's contributions didn't end with her speech at the Bar Association or her programs at Global Tech Solutions. She continued to champion equity and respect in both her corporate work and her community initiatives. One afternoon, as she walked through the same courthouse lobby where it all began, she noticed a plaque on the wall. It read, "In recognition of those who challenge us to be better, to see deeper, and to act with fairness." Inspired by the events of Courtroom 304, Sarah smiled as she read it, reflecting on how a simple parking citation had grown into something so much bigger. Justice, she realized, wasn't just about laws or rules, it was about people. And sometimes, the greatest changes began in the unlikeliest of places. With the autumn breeze catching her hair once again, she stepped outside, ready for whatever challenge came next.